Today, I want to look at God's will from a very different perspective. I want to look at it through the lens of the other gods in the Bible. The other gods in the Bible. So if you would join me in Deuteronomy chapter 32, we're going to look at verses 7 through 9. And it says this, it says, "Remember the days of old. Consider the years of many generations. Ask your father, and he will show you, your elders, and they will tell you. When the Most High gave to the nations their inheritance, when he divided mankind, he fixed the borders of the people," don't miss this, "according to the number of the sons of God. But the Lord's portion, his people, Jacob, he allotted heritage." The number of the sons of God. Have you ever been reading through the book of Genesis and you get to the story of Babel, and you just find it kind of confusing? Like, is God really concerned that humans can build a tower high enough? Like what kind of architecture are we dealing with here? Beyond the fact that we know the spiritual world is not necessarily just in the sky. So, theologically, that doesn't really make sense. And then what does he do? He says he goes down and he's going to confuse their language. Or perhaps there's actually more going on in the unseen realm. You see, what really happens at Babel is a whole new cast of spiritual enemies of God enter the world. Enemies that would change the earth's geography. Because we're told in Deuteronomy 32 about what happened at Babel. That when God created the nations, what did he do? He divided up the human race according to the sons of God. Who are the sons of God? That is God's divine counsel. That is a divine counsel that existed before he created the world. And what we find is he establishes the boundaries of the people according to the members in that heavenly court. But then we have this really key part where he says, the Lord's portion, his people, he kept as his own. So when did the human race become nations? It happened at Babel. Now join me in Genesis 11, verses 6 through 8, and I want you to notice the plural language when we get to verse 7. "And the Lord said, Behold, they are one people, they have one language, and this is only the beginning of what they will do, and nothing they propose to do will now be impossible for them." But notice this, it says, "Come, let us go down and confuse their language so that they may not understand one another's speech." So the Lord dispersed them from there over the face of all the earth, and they left the building of the city. Let us go down and confuse their language. He doesn't say, I will. He doesn't say, Yahweh will. He says, let us go down. And so the first text we read in Deuteronomy, it tells us that God allotted the nations according to the number in his heavenly court, members of his divine council. And in the Genesis text, we find the support of what Deuteronomy was saying, let us go down. And this is the reason the ancient nations in the Old Testament worshiped other gods. And this is why when we read the Old Testament, we see God has this ferocious response to his people worshiping other gods. Like if you've read one of those texts and you thought, man, this just seems like a little extreme. It's just an idol of something. It's not. And this is why God's anger in the Old Testament is towards other nations. But here's where we miss it. It's not centrally about other people. It is the wicked sons of God who are ruling those nations in an attempt to usurp God's power, but also to usurp the shalom he is trying to restore from the Garden of Eden. And so when we see this fierce anger that God has, this ferocious might, it's not against the people. It is wicked sons of God who are trying to become their own God. And so when we talk about God's will for your life, it does not exist in a vacuum. It exists in the context of very real spiritual stories. I want to take you back to 2005. 2005, I graduated high school. And when you graduate high school, what is the question everybody asks you? What are you going to do when you grow up? I am 37. I don't think I'm grown up yet, but I'm getting there. I'm getting there. And so I had this kind of ministry moment at 17. Wasn't planning on it, but I ended up having the opportunity to preach in a chapel. I get off that stage, and I go, this is what I'm supposed to do with my life. So I just graduate, and I get asked that question. I get asked it at the doctors. I get asked it by friends, all kinds of people. And I have one of the most bizarre weeks of my life. I get in a major accident on I-75. 2 days later, I slice open my leg. And towards the end of the week, I am lying in my bed, and I begin to hear typing on my computer. And I begin to hear scratching on walls. And I literally get out of bed, and I go full Pentecostal, and in the name of Jesus, you will leave now, and it's gone. And it's gone. Why is that? Because what was that question and what was I answering? I want to be a pastor. See, how we think about the spiritual unseen realm will profoundly affect our understanding of the will of God. So join me in Exodus 34, verse 6. It says, the Lord passed before him and proclaimed, the Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness. Now, before we talk about this verse, we need to clarify an exegetical point. And exegetical just means a careful study and interpretation of Scripture. So in this verse, we see God make a proclamation. And in the proclamation, he says his name twice and then gives the title God. Now, anytime you are reading the Old Testament and you see the name Lord in all caps, that's referring to the personal name of God. It's not a typo. It's referring to Yahweh. So a better translation of this to understand kind of the theological impact here is to say, Yahweh, Yahweh, God is merciful. Except he doesn't say that. He says, Yahweh, Yahweh, a God is merciful. And this is very, very significant for us, and here's why. When my girls were little, they would, few words, right? They had a few different words, but the best word they knew beyond anything else was the word Dada. Now they're a little older, they're 8 and 6, and they still call me Dada when they want something. But here's the key point. I can go by the name Dada or Dad because there are no other dads for my girls. So why does in this text does God give us his personal name not once, but twice? And not only does he give it, he repeats it. Well, in today's world, if you want to say something with emphasis, whether it's in an email or a text or on Facebook, what are you going to do? You're going to put it bold in caps, right? You're going to get as many exclamation points as you can, and you're going to throw in a few emojis for good measure. Like you're trying to communicate your point. Well, in the ancient world, if you wanted to really drive home a point, you would repeat it twice. So when Yahweh says his personal name twice, it's his way of saying he wants us to slow down. And I want you to think about what is being said. See, God's name is not God. That's who he is, but that is not his name. In fact, in the Bible, he's rarely called God. He's often called Yahweh or Yahweh God. Now let's go back to that article. The verse then says, a God. Does not say the God, does not say God, it says a God. Now, is that by accident? Is that by chance? No. And the reason may hit you like a freight train, it's because there are many gods. Yahweh uses his personal name twice because he's not the only one. And so, Exodus 34:6, it puts strong emphasis on God's personal name because there are many gods. Now, this is probably new to a lot of us. Some of you may be thinking, I've never heard this. Some of you are thinking, there's no way that's true. And some of you are new and thinking, honey, if you bust out snakes, we're running out the door. But just stay with me for a little bit, because we're going to walk through some texts. So first is Psalm 97:9. And what does it say? It says, for you, O Lord, are most high over all the earth. But then what's that second part? You're exalted far above all gods. This verse is telling us there are other gods. In Exodus 20, we find the 10 Commandments. What is the first commandment? It says, you shall have no other gods before me. And the very first thing listed, particularly in the ancient Near East, that is always the thing of most importance. And so what is the thing that God highlights above anything else of all the things he wants us to hear and obey? This first commandment is have no other gods before me. And here's the problem in the 21st century. The first commandment says, you shall have no other gods before me. And then the second commandment says, you shall not make for yourself a carved image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, describing idols. And what we've done in the modern world is we've kind of collapsed these two ideas together. Have no other gods, don't make idols. And when we do this, we begin to think about these gods as non-entities. We look at this verse and we say the focus is, don't have any idol in your heart. Don't make things like God. Don't make money ultimate, or sex ultimate, or fame ultimate, or whatever. Fill in the blank. Yet that's not what we should be doing with these two commandments. And the Old Testament people of God, they would have thought it was very bizarre that we collapsed the two commandments together. And you know who else thinks it's really strange? The whole Eastern world. See, in the Western world, particularly Europe and the US, we believe rationalism is king. Everything has an explanation. But in the majority of the world, that's not true. The majority of the world recognizes there is more to play than just rationalism. You see, we think we pity the Eastern world, when in reality, they pity us. And if you still don't believe me, let's go to Exodus again. In Exodus 7, 10 through 11, we find this fascinating story. It says, Moses and Aaron, they went to Pharaoh just as the Lord commanded. And Aaron cast his staff before Pharaoh and the servants, and it became a serpent. Then Pharaoh summoned the wise men and the sorcerers and the magicians of Egypt, and the same thing happened by their secret arts. Now, how are these magicians able to do what Aaron did? Because Aaron could not do that on his own ability. He did it with the help of God. He did it with the help of Yahweh. A human being cannot do that on their own. If you want, you can go practice outside with some sticks. Let me know how that goes. So how then, if a human can't do that, how were these magicians able to do the same thing? They did it with the help of their gods. Further, Exodus 12, we read that Yahweh says, I bring judgment, and notice the plurality, on all the gods of Egypt. Now, many of us know the story of the 10 plagues from Exodus that God then sends to Egypt to free his people. But what we may not know is that many of the plagues were directed at specific Egyptian gods. As an example, Amun-Ra is the god of sun in Egypt. He was also the king of all the gods in Egypt. So what does Yahweh do? He blots out the sun. For 3 days, it's pitch black because Yahweh's gangster. He doesn't play around. This is Yahweh's version of saying, Amun-Ra is not the king over the gods. I am. And so when Israel is finally out from under the oppression of Egypt, we read Yahweh had brought judgment on all their gods. Again, notice the possessive noun, their gods, signifying the distinction between the one true God, Yahweh. And then referring back to the release of Israel, Exodus 18:11, it says, now I know that the Lord is greater than all gods, because in this affair the gods dealt arrogantly with the people of Israel. And if we go back a few chapters earlier, in chapter 15, we kind of see the people's response, and they burst out in this song of praise in Exodus 15:11. It says, who is like you, O Lord, among the gods? Who is like you, majestic in holiness, awesome in glorious deeds, doing wonders? You stretched out your right hand, and the earth swallowed them. And them being the wicked sons of God, disobedient members of God's divine counsel. And we see the same refrain echoed throughout the Psalms. Psalm 86, it says, among the gods, there is none like you, Yahweh. Psalm 96, great is Yahweh and most worthy of praise. He is to be feared above all the gods. And then this one found in Psalm 97, worship him, all you gods, for you, Yahweh, are the most high over all the earth and are to be exalted over all the gods. So even the gods are commanded to worship Yahweh. And the reason why is because there is a hierarchy. Yahweh is at the top. He is in his own category. The way the theologian Jerry Breshears puts it, all the other gods are lowercase gods. So what does the first commandment then, don't worship other gods, really mean? And too often we skip over this commandment because we just assume, well, there's no other gods. There's only Yahweh. But that's not what the Bible tells us. The Bible presents the assumption with support that there are other gods and we're not to worship them. And let's look at how specific the Bible gets. We're going to go to the book of 1 Kings, and we're going to read about the power and wonder of an Israel king named King Solomon. So everything's going well with King Solomon. Then we get to chapter 11, verses 1 through 8. And it says, now King Solomon loved many foreign women. You could literally underline and circle when he says many, along with the daughter of Pharaoh, Moabite, Ammonite, Edomite, Sinite, Hittite, all those names. And from the nations concerned which the Lord had said to the people of Israel, you shall not enter into marriage with them, neither shall they with you, for surely they will turn away your heart after other gods. And Solomon clung to these in love. He had 700 wives who were princesses and 300 concubines. I won't say what that says in the Passion Version. And his wives turned away his heart. For when Solomon was old, his wives turned away his heart to the other gods, and his heart was not wholly true to the Lord his God, as the heart of his father David. For Solomon went after Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, after Milcom, the abomination of the Ammonites. And so Solomon did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and did not wholly follow the Lord as David his father had done. And he built high places for Shamash, the abomination of Moab, and for Molech, the abomination of the Ammonites. Now notice what the writer does. He lists off a number of ancient gods, but nowhere in the text does he say these are false gods, con gods, superstitious gods. In fact, the text even goes further and it gives them names. And so Ashtoreth is a goddess of Sidon, which is modern-day Lebanon. Molech is the god of Ammon, which is modern-day Jordan. And Shamash was over Moab, which is another part of Jordan. And these are gods with power and authority over geographic regions and ethnic groups. But here's, I think, the wildest one of all. It's going to get really specific in the book of Daniel. Because in Daniel, there's this crazy story where Daniel's prayers go unanswered for 3 weeks. And then finally, an angel appears to him and says he was late because the prince of the Persian kingdom kept him at bay for 21 days. That an angel of God could not get to Daniel because another spiritual being, a wicked member of God's divine council, the prince of Persia, who had more power than this particular angel, because if you know the text, Michael, the archangel, has to come and do battle as well. This prince is some sort of spiritual god in the Persian Empire. But then it gets even crazier because the angel says, I have to leave because I now have to go fight the prince of Greece. Well, who are these? These are gods over people, places, and nations. And here is arguably, I would say, the most important verse in the Bible related to this. It's found in Psalm 82, verse 1. It says, God has taken his place in the divine council, and in the midst of the gods, he holds judgment. And this is one of the several places in the Bible where we read about a collection of divine beings being over the earth. But the chapter continues. It says, "How long will you judge unjustly and show partiality to the wicked? They have neither knowledge nor understanding. They walk about in darkness. All the foundations of the earth are shaken." What are these gods doing? They are wreaking havoc on the earth. And what we find in Psalm 82 is God's response, which is going to be no more, knock it off. It says, "I said, you are gods. You are all sons of the Most High." But notice this, "You will die like mere mortals. You will fall like every other ruler." And then there's the closing prayer of this line. "Rise up, O God, judge the earth, for," don't miss it, "all the nations are your inheritance." Why is God doing battle in the Old Testament? Because he wants his people back. He wants all the nations. And so the Bible is explicitly presenting to us how we should think about spiritual beings. They are not abstract ideas. They are gods with very real power and are very real. Have you ever been in a spiritually charged area? Maybe on a mission trip to a foreign country? Maybe even here in the States, and you're just kind of passing by a temple of some sort? And you can just feel this spiritual presence. You can feel a spiritual darkness. It doesn't feel fake. I mean, you can't see it, but you can sense it. It's not a hoax. It's not superstition. There's a presence you can feel, but once you leave the area, it's almost like something just came off of me. Like I had something oppressively over me, and once I left that space, I left that area, all of a sudden, I feel like I can breathe again. And we live with an illusion about the Eastern world. We believe that if those nations are elevated out of poverty, if they begin to think like 21st century rationalists, they'll get over all this spiritual mumbo jumbo. And yet they would look at you and I and say, your worldview is way too small. Because the spiritual world is just as real as the natural world. And the gods of the Old Testament are still here today. Now, in our culture, we prefer to use the term angels and demons. And there's a number of reasons why, but it's not really accurate. And part of it is just the baggage that comes with names. Because even as I say angels, some of you, don't raise your hand, you thought of a handsome Swedish model on the front of a cover of a romance novel at Publix that says, "Heart to Steal." And when I say demons, some of you thought of something red with ears, and it's got like a weird tail, and it's got a pitchfork. I don't know why we think demons are farmers, but whatever. But that's not accurate. And when the Bible refers to specifically demons, these are not the wicked sons of God. Demons were not a part of God's divine counsel. They do not have the same power as the other gods have. They did not exist in the Garden of Eden. They did not always exist, but that is another sermon for another day. And what happens is when we don't see these gods accurately, we begin to do a few things. First, we see the term and we use it as being synonymous with demons. So again, we picture like a little red demon who wants to give your car a flat tire and make you overeat Twinkies and become a New York Jets fan. Or we see them as like these ferocious creatures like from a horror movie. But that's not accurate. It's not an accurate picture of what a demon is. But more importantly, that has nothing to do with the gods that we're talking about in the Old Testament. The other challenge with this is the language in the Old Testament is always gods. If you go through your Old Testament, you're going to find the word demon is used one time. Now, demons are the focal point in the New Testament for a variety of reasons. They are not in the Old Testament. And I realize this is a lot to take in, so let's kind of step back a bit. The most important thing to note is there is one true creator God. The wicked sons of God, who were members of his divine council, and demons cannot create out of nothing. They're not eternal in the same sense as Yahweh. They didn't always exist, and they will someday be destroyed. There's only one true creator of the universe. He has no equal. He has no parallel. But there is a multiplicity of wannabe gods, these divine sons who want to usurp God's power, who want God's power and God's fame as their own. They're invisible, but very real. So there's God, Yahweh, and there are all these lowercase g gods. Now, you may not feel comfortable using the term gods. That's fine. What we can't argue with is that's not in the Bible. And I think the whole point of this is it really doesn't matter what you call them. That's not the point. What matters is that they're real. They're not myths. They're not fake. They still have influence over areas. These are the principalities and powers that Paul is referring to. Now, as a couple points of clarification, this does not mean, as an example, all of Greek mythology is historically accurate. Some of it might be. A lot of it, though, is probably tied to either ancient imagination mixed with the interpretation of finding dinosaur bones and trying to make sense of them. But we do need to recognize that there's a lot we don't know. So are there varying levels of a power and authority? Yes, it seems so. The Bible clearly indicates they have authority over nations. How much power and authority? We don't know. But there's obviously a limit because they're under divine God. How many are there? We don't know. And then what about the devil? What role does he play in this? Well, the devil was the very first supernatural rebel. And we know the story well, right? Go back to Genesis. The talking snake tempts Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. However, when we look at the whole Old Testament, we find there's a lot of other aspects to this origin story. So in Ezekiel 28:14, we're told that this divine being, the devil, was a cherub. Now don't think, cute little thing, I know it was Valentine's Day and I'm going to shoot you with an arrow. That's not what a cherub was. Specifically, he was a guardian cherub. That this supernatural being was meant to be a guardian within the Garden of Eden. And in the ancient Near East, it was very common to associate divine guardians as either snakes or dragons. You're going to find this in Mesopotamia and Egypt as well. And so Eden was meant to be God's home base on earth. Eden was not meant to stay as Eden. This was home base that was meant to spread across the whole world. It was also the place of his divine counsel. And in the midst of this is a rebel who doesn't want a seat at the table. But Isaiah 14:13 tells us that this being wanted to ascend the heavens above the stars of God and set his throne on high. This supernatural rebel wanted to be over the divine council. And so we can think of the devil as a part of this story, but don't think of it necessarily that he's just simply the arch enemy of God and all these others don't matter. That's not how it lays out. What else do we know about these gods? We know they have some measure of free will. They can love God, like we see with the archangel Michael and Gabriel, or they can hate God. Some are good, others are evil. The big idea, though, is this: there is an invisible world all around you that is just as real as the visible one. Most of us don't buy this. Or at least we don't buy it all the time. Because we tend to be functional materialists. We believe in God, we believe in angels and demons, but we want to think that the demonic powers and stories we see in the scriptures have either settled down or just moved out of America. But that's not true. And it's because we've been shaped by science and the Enlightenment that tells us that the only thing that is real is what we can see and explain. And the majority of the world looks at us and thinks, that's bizarre. And we're the ones they pity. Let's turn now to one of the most well-known texts on spiritual warfare. It's Ephesians 6:12. It says, "For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. Now, notice the language the author uses: rulers, authority, cosmic power. Paul is stressing for us that we have to have a big picture understanding of what spiritual warfare is. Paul is emphasizing that the true battle we have is against the gods of this world. And he's stressing to us that the spiritual world is just as real as the material one. And at times, as American Christians, we have created this kind of distinction between the spiritual and material world. And the text is telling us that's not how things are, that the spiritual world and the material world are actually pretty intertwined. And where we think there is division and distinction, there's actually connection. And so what we've done so far is kind of paint a picture of the backdrop of what spiritual warfare is. And I want to correct a few myths related to these gods that we find in the Old Testament. So myth one, God, Yahweh, is not simply one of the gods. Like, we hear this language of gods, and some of us, it kind of concerns us. He is in a whole nother category, stratosphere. You can live with peace knowing God is the only one who is all-powerful, all-knowing, all-present, all-perfect, all-good. They are not in the same category. This is just the language the Bible uses. And the language is because this is what dominates our landscape. That's why the Bible uses that. The Bible doesn't want you to think that this is just an old-time thing or certain areas of life. No. This is very real and present. Myth two is that everything bad is a demon or the work of the wicked sons of God. Like, the odds are you got a flat tire because your tires are bald and you need to change them. That does not mean everything bad that happens was caused by a wicked spiritual power. Now, it can be. I think a wild story to me in the New Testament is Jesus is in a boat and a storm rises up. And what does Jesus do? He rebukes the storm. So this is not just some natural weather. This is some divine Son of God who has some ability with the storm. Jesus can't rebuke himself. So for him to get up and I rebuke the storm means there was something evil behind it. Myth three, nothing is ever the work of the other gods or demons. And we often jump to this, and although as Christians we cannot be spiritually possessed, we can still be attacked. And so we have to become aware of this. And the way we do that is through a life of prayer, where we begin to cultivate a spiritual sensitivity. And here's the tricky part, that we would have the maturity and wisdom to identify when this is a spiritual issue and when this is just an issue with me or other people. Not everything is like this. Sometimes we can get pinned down. Well, it's just a spiritual issue. No, it probably isn't. Probably some habits you need to change in your life. Which leads us to the next one, which is your main issue is a spiritual issue. Maybe, but it's not always a spiritual issue. It may be the results of bad habits. If you can't stop eating pizza, it's the demon of Little Caesars. But some things are just simply bad choices. Myth 5, the gods are mostly at work in non-Western countries. If you want to read The Art of War, the first rule of war is surprise your enemy. The enemy is much more subtle in a Western context, and we'll get into that in a bit. And then myth 6 is that, well, what do I do? We're just powerless. No, Ephesians tells us what to do. Put on the whole armor of God. And so this sermon this morning, it's about bringing awareness, not bringing fear. Right. You have Yahweh, the one who looked at Amon-Ra and said, blackout, I'm the only true God. Right. Now, I'm aware this sermon today is a bit jarring for some, but just stay with me for a little bit longer, because I think what we're getting into today will have a profound impact on not just the unseen realm, spiritual world, but also how we understand God's will for our lives. And so I want to end by looking at 3 areas that we should think differently about based on our understanding of the supernatural. The first is evil. This is one of the, if not the primary objection people have towards God. Evil exists. Therefore, there must not be a God. But what's interesting is when you read the biblical authors, there is very little that is ever said on the problem of evil. And the reason is because it's not up for debate, it's just assumed. Because if human beings have a measure of free will, and spiritual beings have a measure of free will, that means there are a lot of wills at play. God's will, your will, my will, devil's will, the wicked sons of God. And so by living in God's free world, some wills are going to submit to God's life-given authority, and others will live in flat-out rebellion. And too often, we rarely give place to the free will of other human beings or spiritual beings and the effect they have on our lives. And so when we do this, the tendency is to attribute evil to God rather than to the devil or demonic forces. And we become stagnant. At times we give up, and we don't fulfill what God really has for us because we have our sight in the wrong direction. But planet Earth is the site of a cosmic war. That means there will be collateral damage. That at times and in all the ways, the work of the devil, the wicked sons of God, demons, is to disrupt God's shalom. See, at all times and all ways, the devil's not thinking about you. He's thinking about God. He's thinking about how can I disrupt what he is trying to create. That God, with the divine counsel, had a supernatural family. But God created us, not because he needed to, but out of love. He wanted an earthly family. And that is why the number of places the devil will attack is your marriage, is your children, is your relationships. He's going after that because he's trying to get to God. So why is there evil? Because there are spiritual beings that exist that have caused and stirred up evil. Evil is the work of the devil, the wicked sons of God, demons, and the work of people who have rebelled against God. And evil exists because spiritual beings and human beings have chosen to not follow the one true God. As one theologian puts it, when we possess a vital awareness that in between God and humanity, there is this vast society of spiritual beings with free will, then there's no difficulty reconciling the evil in the world with the goodness of God. The second thing is spirituality. Our American culture is very spiritual. And we have to be careful when it comes to spirituality. Tarot cards, palm readers, which are more popular than ever, and we can laugh them off or recognize, no, there's something legitimate there. That Satanism is not a joke. Witchcraft is not a joke. And here's the bigger, more important piece. We have to recognize that people are always spiritual, just not always with the spirit of Jesus. And this changes everything. Because we can't go into the assumption you're not spiritual. I hate to break it to you, you don't have that choice. Like if you're created in the image of God, you are going to be spiritual. What spirit are you aligned with? There is no neutral. And when we don't recognize this, here's what we do as Christians, is we think all they need is to be convinced that Jesus is the way. That's not always the case. Rather, people often need to be delivered from the wrong spirit before they can recognize that Jesus is the right spiritual way. And so this should profoundly shape how we evangelize. That they may need more than just to hear the gospel. That there may be a subtle or not subtle spiritual oppression that is at play. That simply presenting the gospel is not enough. There is a spiritual dimension that you and I war against. Then lastly is idolatry. And there are commands all over Scripture about idolatry. And too often, as the church, our view of idolatry is simply this: if anything becomes more fundamental than God to your happiness and identity, that's an idol. Now, that's true to some level, but there's a lot more to idolatry. An idol is not just a good thing that becomes ultimate. Rather, it's a representation, a way of being that represents another spiritual being. Now, sure, there are some idols that are irrelevant, like a wooden statue of Zeus has no meaning. But there are others that are connected to real relationship with something. Now, we don't have a whole lot of temples in the Western world. We don't have a whole lot of relics as we might think of relics in a traditional sense. But we do have temples. Our temples happen to be malls, sports stadiums, and probably the greatest one is Senate chambers. And so worship becomes a sacrifice of money, time, and family. That behind these non-spiritual presence is sometimes a real spiritual being. Have you ever felt uncomfortable with the way someone has put their faith in a political party or politician? As if this party or this person is the savior of America. Because the way some people think about Senate chambers and the Oval Office is very concerning. How they vehemently oppose anyone who thinks differently. Like, we have a very adulterous view of politics in the US. Why? Because there is a spiritual oppression behind that. Or what about our culture's obsession with sex in the dark underbelly of hardcore sex trafficking, child prostitution that happens where? Here. All of this exists in Ocala, and you're telling me there's not something demonic behind that? Or our pursuit of money in the West and the high cost of globalization, that there are more than 28 million slaves in the world today, more than there has ever been. Just for a tiny fraction of Westerners to live in luxury, it takes millions of people being oppressed. And you're telling me the nightmare of global trade and slavery is not demonic? And we can go on and on and on, but the point is to recognize there is more at play. That spiritual beings are real. Now, the point is not that you would leave here calling them gods. It doesn't really matter what you call them. The point is that they are active as they are today, as they were 5,000 years ago. And as followers of Christ, we have to be willing to be comfortably uncomfortable. That much of the pain and the evil we see in the world today is the work of evil spiritual powers who are trying to, one aim, disrupt God's shalom. One aim, disrupt the family God is trying to build. Because if we never address the supernatural powers behind the scenes, then we're going to fail to see the change we want to happen. Now, as I close out, you and I, we don't have to live in fear. But we do have to live with an understanding that there is a spiritual world that exists. It is not distinct, it is not separate from our physical world, but it is intimately connected and intertwined. And like the Apostle Paul says, we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers and principalities, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. You don't have to be afraid, but you do have to be aware, to be vigilant, and to take with great seriousness. Because your effectiveness in the kingdom of God and to fulfill His will for your life is a direct result of your awareness and your presence against the kingdom of darkness.